studying honoring marriage. We're still in the Ten Commandments. I'm going to pray and we'll get started. Thank you, Father, so much for this day, for this week that you have given us. We thank you for the cool weather. And we ask you, Father, just to be with us. Speak through me now. Help me to speak the words that you have for me, and only those words, Father. I thank you for loving us, for we love you, and we ask you now to be with us and to help us take these words that you have us to hear and use them to glorify you. In Jesus' precious name I do pray. Amen. All right, ladies, if you want to turn to Exodus chapter 20, we're going to look first at that verse, and then we'll turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 11, and we'll be there. But today we are talking about honoring marriage, and the concept of marriage, would you not agree, has certainly changed over the years. Just think about it for a moment. You know, what God intended to be, till death do we part, is now thought more of as until we no longer get along. And that is so true. And, you know, marriage between a man and a woman, as well as the physical relationship between the two, no longer seems to be honored like it was at one time, especially when we were younger. I just believe that, and I do believe now that things have changed so much from what God intended them to be. Of the 6 commandments that deal with our personal relationships to others, the violation of this commandment, the 7th, the one that says thou shalt not commit adultery, generates emotions that cause hurt and loss of trust, and a genre of other emotions. And one commentary even went as far as to say that once this one is broken, the act cannot be undone. And that pretty much puts it in a nutshell. But not only are we going to be talking about this commandment today, we're going to be talking about the story of David and Bathsheba. And that's the type of story that goes along well with what we're talking about today. You know, although David is remembered as the young man who defeated Goliath, and he did so mightily, and he's also known as the king whose life story is one of adultery and murder, all of those things, even apart from each other, really what is summed up to be the best for him, or the thing that he is known of as the best, is when God said, he is a man after my own heart. Wouldn't you love for God to say that about you? That we are women after his own heart. You know, David wasn't perfect. We're not perfect. And God could still say that about him. So as we will see in today's verses, David's sin of adultery and murder caused a lot of pain that could have been so easily avoided. And you know, his story, along with all the other stories that are found in the Bible, are there to give us stories to go by, to let us know how to live, whether to live one way or the other, right or wrong. But although David's behavior was sinful, he was forgiven. And that's the thing that we need to remember the most. You know, as we will see, David is going to see Bathsheba as an object to be used, and to be used for his own purposes. So that leaves me with a question that I want to ask you today as you think about that. How do we see people? Do we also use them in ways in which we shouldn't use them? Or do we see them like Jesus does, and see them as people who are worth loving and who are worth giving ourselves to? So let's get started. If someone would read Exodus 20:14. Now, along in these verses, I have asked some of you to look up some other verses that will come along, and hopefully I will remember to ask you to look at those. But let's look at Exodus 20:14, and we'll begin. Very simple, short, straight to the point verse.
I'll read it.
Please do.
Do not commit adultery.
Okay. Very short and simple, isn't it? But boy, is it so full of truth. I think one of the things that I have noticed the most about studying these Ten Commandments, ladies, is that what I one time took for granted, I now have learned so much about them. And as I was thinking about these commandments coming from school this afternoon, I was thinking about how God loved us and loved people so much, His creation so much, that He came up with things for us to do or not do in order to help us to know how to interact with each other, to treat each other correctly and well, so that we could enjoy life as He intended for it to be. But if you will remember, God was establishing His covenant community, and the relationship that existed among the people was very important. And this was a time in history, and we all know this time was a time in which women were not highly thought of. And they were considered nothing more than property, and they were often bought or possibly sold or even taken by force if somebody could get away with doing that. But in the law at this time, it generally protected only the men and the man's rights. And it gave little consideration to women, even in the case of assault. And the more I read about that and learned about that, it was as if it didn't really matter what had been done to the woman. It was more of an offense against, if she was married, it would have been against her husband. Or if she was not married and maybe engaged, then it would have been against her to-be husband. And so the act that was used against her, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you, the act that was used against her or done against her was, it was more as if it had been done against the man. And the woman really was not even considered in the whole picture of things. And it even went on to say that it was as if it was someone that was not married, that the act would have been more against her father than her. So they weren't worried about her feelings or her whatever was going on, what may have happened to her. So it was a time in which marriage was not exactly what it should be. And so what God was doing here was He was bringing up a new foundation for this marriage. And God's marriage covenant was to be considered untouchable. It was to be absolute. And it was what He said it should be. And that was within the covenant community. From the beginning of time, we know in Genesis that God intended for marriage to be a blessed union. And it was between a man and a woman. And He also approved of the sexual union of the two within that marriage. And so all of that, if it had just been done as God had first intended it to be. But as we have just spoken earlier, it has changed. It has changed so much from what it was first intended by God. In fact, I know you all know these verses because they were probably spoken at our marriage. When God says a man is to leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. So all of those are the things in which we are thinking about today with this verse. But one thing that I do want you to understand that I guess I didn't realize was that once God had established this commandment, that the Israelites took it very, very seriously. In fact, even David took this command seriously, as we'll learn in just a few moments. But I did ask a couple of you to look up some verses that are found in the Old Testament just to let you see how Israel thought about adultery. So the first one is Job 24:13 through 17, and I'm not real sure who I gave that to.
It was me.
Okay. All right. Barbara, would you read that, please?
Job 24:13. There are those who rebel against the light, who are not acquainted with its ways and do not stay in its paths. The murderer rises before it is light, that he may kill the poor and the needy, and in the night he is like a thief. The eye of the adulterer also waits for the twilight, saying, no eye will see me, and he veils his face. In the dark they dig through houses, by day they shut themselves up. They do not know the light. For the deep darkness is mourning to all of them, for they are friends with the terrors of deep darkness.
So in these verses, the adulterers were put with what people? Murderers and thieves. And then in Hosea 1:2, I'm not sure who I gave that verse to either. Okay, yes.
I'm gonna, y'all, I don't have my glasses.
Oh, would you like
I
mine?
can't read, but I may not be able to see. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord.
And what was actually happening there is when the prophets looked for an image in which to describe Israel's sins against God, they used the image of adultery. And then also Leviticus 20:10 and Deuteronomy 22:22. Okay?
Okay, Leviticus 20:10. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And then Deuteronomy 22:22. If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel.
So, as you can see, adultery was definitely considered a capital crime. So why did we even go through all of that? The main thing that I wanted you to understand was at the time that this was given, this commandment was given, it was literally a call to the Hebrew people to live in a completely different way than all the people that lived around them. And so God was saying, I need you to live in a higher standard than what you see going on around you. You know, God wanted the people to see that marriage in itself was to be a commitment and a loyalty, not only to the spouses involved, but also to God. And He also intended for there to be a healthy family. And a lot of us, especially teachers, know what it's like when you have children who are in a divorce situation at home. And it was to protect the children also and let them to see what a blessing marriage actually is when it is done in the right way. And if you think about it, these children that oftentimes, because of whatever situation, let's just say there has been an adultery, a crime. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. There has been adultery in the marriage. And the children oftentimes, especially as they're older, become very angry at the parents over that situation. And so that was not to be either. God did not intend for families to live this way. He wanted them to be happy. You know, the truth is, ladies, and as hard as it is to really even teach this lesson today, as you can see, I'm struggling somewhat. You know, the truth is that whenever a man chooses to live selfishly, because that's all it is that there's going to be hurt, and hurt will be the result. You know, one of the commentaries made this statement, and I thought it was really, really a good statement. It was talking about the marriage, how marriage is sanctioned by God. And this is what it said. Nothing is more sacred or more meaningful than the love of a man and a woman who have committed themselves to each other for life. And that is so true. Now, what we're going to do next, we're going to go from this and we're going to go into the story of David and Bathsheba. It's a very familiar story. We know it already. We've heard it many times, but hopefully we will find something a little different than what we are familiar with. Maybe we can come away with something a little bit different. So if anybody has anything as we go along that you want to say, please do so. Forget the camera. 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 3a, if somebody would read that.
In the spring, when kings marched out to war, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up in his bed and strolled around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. So David sent someone to inquire about her.
Okay. I thought it was interesting as I studied about that at this time in the life of David, things could not have been better. He was well on his way to being an established king on his throne. He had a lot of military successes under his belt. David's life, though, was about to take a horrible turn. And faced with the decision of whether or not to give in to temptation that stood before him, which literally she did, David chose to walk straight into what would become the greatest of heartaches for him as well as Bathsheba. It would be the murder of an innocent man and the death of a child, all because of that one temptation. And you know, that's a tragedy that could have only been avoided. All three of those could have been avoided if only David had put God first. But you know, we can go and we can be very judgmental, I guess, about David. But yet, how many times have we too made decisions when we've been tempted that have caused us a problem or someone around us a problem? I think we all can say we've done that at one time or another. But you know, the Bible does not give us an answer as to why David decided to send Joab. It was somewhat unusual for him to do so because he was a fighting king, and he would have been there with his soldiers all along. But this was actually not the first time he had stayed away. He had actually one other time when the men had gone out to fight. He had stayed out as well. But you know, it really doesn't matter why he stayed there. And if you think about the story too, from what she just read, it said that he had been taking a nap. You know, the homes back then were flat roofed. His home would have been probably higher than everyone else's, and so he could look down. It was a place where a lot of activity could go on at the home that no one below would even know was going on. But he had actually been taking a nap, very innocent, nothing, so far no problem. He then wakes up from this nap. Still, he hasn't done anything wrong. He's walking around. But then he looks out and he sees this woman, Bathsheba, who is bathing. And David had a choice to make. And we know he made the choice to continue to look. And at that time, instead of turning away, he decides to carry it further. And that's when it went into the lust. He asked someone who she is. Someone knew. They told him. But they also told him who her father was and who her husband was. Now, what we're going to find out as time goes on, we're going to find out that Uriah, her husband, is actually one of David's top warriors. The Bible tells us that. So he would have known who Uriah was. And he was actually considered one of the great 30. And that is found in 2 Samuel 23, if you ever want to go back and read all of that. But David was tempted, and he let this lust be a problem. As I thought about that too, ladies, I thought about when temptation comes our way. Just a moment ago, I made the statement to you that there are often times that temptation happens and we make the choice to not do what we should do, and there have been some problems. But don't you know that all of us in here at one time or another could answer this and fill in the blank? If only I had done this, then something, you fill in the blank, would never have happened. David, at this point, had sinned. But up until this point, he had not. But we know through the next verses, if someone will read 3b through 5, then we'll see what happens.
Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite? David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to him, he slept with her. Now she had just been purifying herself from her cleanliness. Afterwards she returned home. The woman conceived and sent word to inform David, I am pregnant.
Okay. All right. So as the story continues, Bathsheba comes. And I thought it rather funny in a way, I guess, that the commentary kept bringing up Bathsheba, but then it would turn around and it would say, but this story is not about Bathsheba. So we really don't have to know that. But one of the questions that it raised was, why did Bathsheba go?
He was the king.
He was the king. That's right. He was the king. And I guess it really doesn't matter. All we know is that she went.
Well, with women not having much say or position, I guess if the king calls you, you're gonna go.
You're going to go.
Gotta go.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. And of course, we know that she was bathing from what Ann just read. We know why she was bathing. And so, what David, whether or not she had been married, and this, of course, we know that she was, and so therefore it is adultery, he still would not have been doing the right thing, even if she was not married. So it would have been something that was just a sin. And so not soon after that, sometime later, David receives some very life-altering news, and that is about the child. And in verse 5, and I thought this was interesting too, go back and read what verse 5 says one more time. Ann, would you please?
The woman conceived and sent word to inform David, I am pregnant.
I didn't know this, and maybe you did. There's so much I don't know and that I learned. But this is the only recorded words. These are the only recorded words in all of Scripture that Bathsheba said. She's never, ever, there's nothing else that is recorded other than, I am pregnant. Can you imagine how David felt? The rest of the story, as we know, is not in what we're talking about today, but we know what happens. We know that David tries to cover up his failure, and he sends for Uriah to come home, hoping that Uriah will sleep with his wife, and then there will be a reason for her to be pregnant. But what he did not understand was that Uriah was a very honorable man, and he would not agree to sleep with her because of his men, the soldiers. Remember, he was one of the 30. His men were out fighting, and he was not going to enjoy the pleasures of home. So he didn't sleep with her. Well, that didn't help David any, did it? So then David says, okay, now what am I going to do? Well, we know what David did. He sent him to the front of the line. And anytime somebody is sent to the front, that means that they're going to be the first ones that are going to receive the blows from the other side. And we know that David was murdered, basically. even, not David, I'm sorry, Uriah was murdered. Not, I guess, necessarily by the hands of David, but by the wishes of David. David did marry Bathsheba, and he did provide a home for her and for their child. And for a little while, I guess things went okay until the death of that child. So as I said to begin with, this is a very tragic story over a sin that should have never taken place. We've all heard the story before. I think we've talked about it in Sunday school before, about the little boy who would always get in trouble, and whenever he got in trouble, his dad would go out or have him nail a nail in the barn door. And then everything, the child changed and began doing what he should do. And so every time he did something right, he would pull the nail out of the barn door. But yet, when it was all over, the child was discouraged because the barn door was full of holes. As a reminder, temptation comes, and we certainly all have holes in our barn door. But aren't we so thankful that God has putty? Because he tells us that when we ask forgiveness, that they're gone. They're gone away. He fills them with that putty and everything's gone. Do you think he did the same thing for David? He did. He did. If we were to continue to read, we would find out that David was faced with this, and he asked the Lord to forgive him for this. So, as we said to begin with, David was a man after God's own heart, just as we are women after God's own heart. Each of us have something in our lives in which we have cried over, that we wish we had never done. We know that temptations are going to come, and we know sometimes we're going to give in to those temptations. But I'm so thankful that we have a loving God, that no matter when we sin, that if we just ask forgiveness, God forgives us. Jesus took these verses when he was once again talking on the Sermon on the Mount, and he carried them a little bit further, talking about the heart issue, that this was all a heart issue. Sometimes we have heart issues too. But what God is telling us, or what Jesus is telling us, is that when we fix our heart issues, then we fix our sin. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for this day. This was a hard lesson for me. But Lord, I know that you were here. I know that you helped me through this. But God, I just pray that we will learn from this, that we will honor the marriage that God has given us. I pray, God, that you will help us to remember that when temptations come our way, as they did with David, that we will not give in to them. But if those times come in which we fail, and we do, that you are there to forgive us. Thank you for dying on the cross for us. Thank you for loving us. And thank you for every